Welcome to History's Secret Wars, the channel where we tear down the official statues of history to examine the blood-soaked soil beneath them. We uncover the wars fought not for freedom, but for ledger books. Today, we are traveling to the jungles of Central America in the 1950s. You have heard of the Banana Republic. It is a term we use casually today to describe a corrupt, unstable country. But do you know where that term comes from? It wasn't an insult invented by politicians. It was a business model invented by a single corporation. We are going to tell you the story of the United Fruit Company. To the stock market in New York, it was a blue-chip investment. To the people of Guatemala, it was known simply as El Pulpo, the octopus. Why the octopus? Because its tentacles were everywhere. It owned the land. It owned the railroads. It owned the post office. It owned the telegraph lines. And, when the time came, it proved that it owned the United States government. This is the story of how a fruit company became so powerful that it didn't just hire security guards, it hired the CIA. It didn't just lobby politicians, it ordered an airstrike. It is the story of the first time in history that a corporation effectively declared war on a sovereign nation, and won. The year is 1950. Guatemala is waking up from a long nightmare. For decades, the country had been ruled by brutal dictators supported by the United States. Why? Because these dictators kept the bananas cheap. United Fruit controlled 42% of Guatemala's land. They paid zero taxes on exports. They controlled the only port on the Atlantic, Puerto Barrios. If you wanted to ship coffee out of Guatemala, you had to pay United Fruit. They charged exorbitant fees, stifling the local economy while shipping their own bananas for free. They operated a state within a state. On the plantations, American managers lived in the zone, clean houses, swimming pools, golf courses, and English schools. Outside the wire, the Guatemalan workers lived in dirt floor shacks, paid pennies a day, dying of malaria and malnutrition. To the executives in Boston, this was simply good business. They called it the civilizing mission. They believed they were bringing progress to the savages. But to the Guatemalans, it was slavery with a corporate logo. But history has a way of snapping back. In 1944, a revolution swept through Guatemala. The dictator was overthrown. For the first time, free elections were held. A philosopher named Juan José Arevalo, and later a soldier named Jacobo Arbenz, came to power. Arbenz was not a communist. He was a nationalist. He looked at his country and saw a feudal estate run by a foreign company. He saw that 70% of the fertile land was owned by 2% of the population, and most of that 2% was United Fruit. And here is the kicker. United Fruit wasn't even using the land. They kept hundreds of thousands of acres fallow, uncultivated, just to prevent competitors from using it. While peasants starved for lack of land to grow corn, United Fruit sat on an empty empire of dirt. Arbenz decided to act. He didn't want to destroy the company. He just wanted a fair deal. He proposed a land reform. He would buy the unused land from United Fruit and give it to the peasants. This decision was the spark. Arbenz had touched the third rail of American imperialism. He had threatened the bottom line. In the boardrooms of Boston, the executives of United Fruit didn't panic. They didn't negotiate. They picked up the red phone. They knew they couldn't fight the Guatemalan army with banana trucks. They needed a bigger gun. They decided to leverage their connections in Washington to paint a nationalist reformer as a Soviet puppet. They were about to sell a lie to the American public that would destroy a democracy and plunge a nation into 40 years of darkness. The octopus was angry. And when an octopus is threatened, it releases ink to blind its enemy. Next, we uncover the PR war, how the father of modern propaganda, Edward Bernays, turned a dispute over bananas into a terrifying story of red terror at America's doorstep. How do you convince the American public, who had just fought a war against tyranny, to support the overthrow of a democratically elected government? You hire a magician. United Fruit hired Edward Bernays. Bernays is a legend in the dark arts of influence. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He invented the term public relations because propaganda had a bad name. He was the man who convinced women to smoke by calling cigarettes torches of freedom. United Fruit paid him $100,000 a year, a fortune in the 1950s, to solve their Guatemala problem. Bernays knew that Americans didn't care about the price of bananas. They didn't care about land reform. But in 1953, they cared about one thing: communism. Bernays devised a strategy of terror. He ignored the economic reality. He spun a narrative that Guatemala was not a poor nation trying to feed itself, but a Soviet beachhead in the Americas. He claimed that Arbenz was a puppet of Stalin, and that if Guatemala fell, the Panama Canal would be next. He organized junkets for American journalists. He flew reporters from the New York Times, Time magazine, and Newsweek to Guatemala. But he didn't show them the poverty or the unused land. He wined and dined them in the United Fruit luxury compounds. He introduced them to local politicians who were on the United Fruit payroll, who whispered about secret Russian arms shipments. Bernays flooded the U.S. media with fake stories. Guatemala bans the Bible. Guatemalan mobs attack statues of liberty. It was fake news decades before the term existed. But Bernays' most important target wasn't the public. It was the government. He didn't have to work very hard. The connection between United Fruit and the U.S. government was incestuous. Enter the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was the director of the CIA. Before they took office, both men were partners at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. And who was Sullivan and Cromwell's biggest client? United Fruit Company. Allen Dulles had actually sat on the board of directors of United Fruit. They owned stock in the company. So, when United Fruit cried communism, the Dulles brothers didn't see a geopolitical crisis. They saw their own portfolio losing value. President Arbenz had passed Decree 900. This law expropriated the unused land of United Fruit. The Guatemalan government offered to pay the company for the land. They offered the exact value that United Fruit had declared on their tax returns. This was the trap. For years, United Fruit had undervalued their land to avoid paying taxes in Guatemala. They claimed the land was worth $600,000. When Arbenz offered them $600,000, they screamed bloody murder. "It's worth $15 million, they cried. The U.S. State Department, led by John Foster Dulles, formally demanded $15 million on behalf of the company. It was a racket. The U.S. government was acting as the debt collector for a banana corporation. When Arbenz refused to pay the extortionate rate, the decision was made. Diplomacy was over. The secret war was greenlit. President Eisenhower authorized Operation PBSU Success. The CIA was given a budget of $2.7 million to remove Arbenz. But this wouldn't be a marine invasion like in the old days. That was too messy. This would be a psychological operation, a coup designed to make the Guatemalans defeat themselves. The budget was approved. The script was written. Now they needed a star. Next, we meet the Liberator, a failed colonel with a gambling problem, chosen by the CIA to lead a phantom army that existed only on the radio. The CIA needed a face for their coup. They couldn't just have American agents running the government. It had to look like a nationalist uprising. They auditioned candidates like a Hollywood casting call. They needed someone anti-communist, pliable, and ambitious. They found Carlos Castillo Armas. Castillo Armas was a former colonel in the Guatemalan army. He had led a failed coup in 1950 and was living in exile in Honduras. He was a small man with a thin mustache, known for being unimpressive and owing a lot of money. The CIA code named him Caligaris. The agency set him up in Honduras. They gave him money, weapons, and a team of mercenaries. They called his force the Army of Liberation. But there was a problem. The army was pathetic. It had fewer than 500 men. It was a ragtag group of exiles, mercenaries, and adventurers. The Guatemalan military had 5,000 well-trained troops. In a straight fight, Castillo Armas would be wiped out in an hour. The CIA knew this. They knew they couldn't win a military victory. So, they decided to fake one. Operation PB Success was built on the principle of the big lie. If you can't build a real army, build a hallucination of one. The CIA set up a clandestine radio station in the jungles of Nicaragua, later moved closer. It was called La Voz de la Liberación, the Voice of Liberation. They hired talented actors and scriptwriters. They broadcast 24/7 into Guatemala. The radio announcers claimed to be broadcasting from deep within the jungle of Guatemala, surrounded by thousands of freedom fighters. They used sound effects, marching boots, fake battle noises, recorded cheers, to create the illusion of a massive force sweeping across the country. They broadcast fake reports of entire army battalions defecting to the rebels. They announced that columns of tanks were converging on the capital. It was War of the Worlds, but weaponized. The people of Guatemala City, listening to their radios, began to panic. They believed the Liberation Army was a juggernaut. Even the officers in the Guatemalan barracks began to doubt. If the rebels are this strong, they thought, maybe we should switch sides. While the radio station was poisoning the minds of the people, the CIA began the Dirty Tricks campaign. They sent death cards to government officials, literal funeral invitations with their names on them. They made anonymous phone calls to army commanders, warning them that their lives were in danger if they supported Arbenz. They jammed the government radio station so Arbenz couldn't talk to his own people. They created a bubble of fear around the president. But fear alone wasn't enough. The Guatemalan army was loyal. They knew the terrain. They knew Castillo Armas was a weakling. To break the army's will, the CIA needed to bring something new to the battlefield. Something terrifying. Something that United Fruit had plenty of money to buy. Air power. The radio created the ghost, but the planes would deliver the bomb. Next, we take to the skies with the Fruit Company Air Force, a squadron of unmarked World War II fighters flown by American mercenaries, dropping heavy ordnance on a city that had never known war. In 1954, Guatemala had virtually no air force. A few old trainers, nothing more. The CIA changed the equation. They assembled a secret air wing in Nicaragua. They acquired P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, durable World War II fighter bombers. They scrubbed the markings off the planes. They hired American mercenary pilots, men like Jerry DeLarme, a cowboy of the sky who flew for cash and thrills. This was the Liberation Air Force. But everyone knew who paid for the gas. It was the Fruit Company Air Force. On June 18, 1954, the invasion began. Castillo Armas and his 480 men crossed the border. As predicted, they were immediately bogged down. The Guatemalan army blocked them easily. On the ground, the coup was a joke. But then, the planes arrived. The P-47s roared over Guatemala City. They didn't just bomb military targets. They bombed the psychology of the nation. They dropped bombs on fuel tanks, causing massive plumes of black smoke to rise over the city. They strafed the National Palace. They dropped dynamite sticks into the parade grounds of the military bases. Jerry DeLarme, the lead pilot, was creative. To make the Air Force seem larger than it was, he flew constant sorties. He would bomb a target, land, refuel, and take off again in minutes. He also utilized sonic warfare. The pilots would fly low over the city, opening their canopies and dropping empty Coke bottles. As the bottles fell, the wind whistling over their open necks created a terrifying, high-pitched shriek that sounded exactly like a falling bomb. The people on the ground would hear the scream, dive for cover, and wait for an explosion that never came. It was pure psychological torture. It kept the city in a state of permanent panic. President Arbenz was in the National Palace, watching the smoke rise. He tried to call his commanders. "Shoot them down," he ordered. "We can't, Mr. President," they replied. "We have no anti-aircraft guns. We have no planes." The CIA pilots bombed the radio station of the government. They bombed the train station. They bombed the fort of Matamoros. The message was clear. "We control the sky. We can kill you whenever we want." The Guatemalan army officers, who were mostly concerned with their own survival and status, began to do the math. They saw the massive rebel army, which was a lie, and the overwhelming air power, which was just a few planes. They feared that if they fought, the U.S. Marines would be next. The U.S. ambassador, John Purifoy, was the conductor of this orchestra. He walked into the Guatemalan military headquarters with a pistol strapped to his hip, a blatant display of arrogance. He told the generals, "The bombing will stop when Arbenz is gone." Not a minute sooner. It was blackmail at 10,000 feet. The Fruit Company was holding a gun to the head of an entire nation. The planes were screaming, the radio was lying, and the president was alone. Next, we witnessed the suicide of democracy. The final, tragic hours of Jacobo Arbenz, as his own generals, bribed and terrified, walked into his office to demand his resignation. June 27th, 1954. The National Palace. The National Palace. The National Palace. Jacobo Arbenz sat at his desk. He was exhausted. His eyes were red. For 9 days, he had been fighting a ghost. His army had not been defeated on the battlefield. In fact, his troops had easily repelled Castillo Armas's mercenaries at the border, but his army had been defeated in their minds. The CIA's psychological warfare had worked perfectly. The generals believed they were facing a massive U.S. invasion force. They believed the lies on the radio. They believed that fighting meant suicide. Ambassador Purifoy was tightening the screws. He met with the top military brass and made them an offer. Get rid of Arbenz, and the U.S. will recognize you. Keep him, and the bombing continues. That evening, a group of senior officers entered the president's office. They didn't salute. They looked at the floor. "Mr. President," they said, "we can no longer guarantee the safety of the nation. You must resign." Arbenz looked at them. He realized the betrayal was complete. He had armed the people with land reform, but he hadn't armed them with rifles. He had tried to play by the rules of democracy in a game rigged by gangsters. At 9 p.m., Arbenz went on the radio, the real radio, which was barely working. He delivered his farewell address. It was a speech of dignity and bitterness. "They have used the pretext of anti-communism," he said. "The truth is very different. The truth is to be found in the financial interests of the fruit company and the other U.S. monopolies, which have invested great amounts of money in Latin America and fear that the example of Guatemala would be followed by other Latin American countries." He resigned to save his country from further bombing. He thought his sacrifice would stop the violence. He was wrong. After the speech, Arbenz walked out of the palace. He was stripped of his clothes by the guards at the airport, a final humiliation ordered by the CIA, and forced into exile. He would spend the rest of his life moving from country to country, a broken man, eventually dying in a bathtub in Mexico under suspicious circumstances. The coup was a success. Operation PBSU-CKSS had achieved its goal with fewer than 50 combat deaths. It was the perfect covert operation. Cheap, deniable, and effective. In Washington, the Dulles brothers popped champagne. President Eisenhower congratulated the CIA. "You did a magnificent job." But in Guatemala, the party was just for the few. The liberator, Castillo Armas, arrived in the capital on the back of a U.S. plane. He was ready to take orders. And the first order of business? Undo everything. The president was gone, but the bill had to be paid. Next, we opened the Book of Reversal. How Castillo Armas rolled back the clock, burned the books, and returned the land to the Octopus, sparking a fire that would burn for 36 years. July 1954. The liberation was complete. Castillo Armas was installed as president, after a sham election where he was the only candidate and people had to vote orally. Now, it was time to pay the sponsors. Castillo Armas immediately suspended the Constitution. He canceled the land reform. Decree 900 was revoked. The soldiers went out into the countryside, to the peasant families who had just received their small plots of land, their dream of independence. The soldiers tore up the deeds. They burned the crops. They kicked the families off the land and handed the keys back to the United Fruit Company. United Fruit got everything back. Every acre. And they didn't have to pay a dime. The communist threat vanished overnight because it had never existed. The labor unions were dissolved. The minimum wage was abolished. It was a total counter-revolution. But Castillo Armas didn't stop at economics. He launched a cultural purge. He established the National Committee of Defense Against Communism. This was essentially a secret police force modeled on the McCarthy hearings in the U.S., but with death squads. They created a blacklist of 70,000 suspected communists. Teachers, doctors, union leaders, students. If your name was on the list, you disappeared. Books were burned in the streets. Novels by Victor Hugo, Dostoevsky, and Miguel Ángel Asturias, Guatemala's Nobel Prize winner, were thrown into the fire because they were deemed subversive. The U.S. Embassy provided the names for the lists. The CIA helped set up the intelligence apparatus. They were building a police state to protect a plantation. Vice President Richard Nixon visited Guatemala. He hugged Castillo Armas. He called Guatemala the first Latin American country to liberate itself from the yoke of communism. The irony was suffocating. They had liberated the country from democracy and handed it to a dictator who answered to a fruit company in Boston. But you cannot crush the hope of a people without consequences. The peasants who had tasted land ownership, even for a brief moment, would not forget. The students who saw their books burned would not forget. The CIA had won the battle of 1954. But they had started a war that would consume generations. They had radicalized the youth of Latin America. Among the young men watching these events unfold was an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. He was in Guatemala City during the coup. He saw the U.S. planes bombing the city. He saw the betrayal of the army. He concluded that peaceful reform is impossible. He concluded that the only way to fight the octopus was with the gun. He fled to Mexico, where he met a Cuban named Fidel Castro. The banana coup created its own worst enemy. The land was returned, but the seeds of hate were sown. Next, we examine the blowback. How the easy victory in Guatemala led the CIA into a trap of arrogance, leading directly to the disaster at the Bay of Pigs and the horrors of the Guatemalan Civil War. The CIA analysts in 1954 wrote mission accomplished on the file of Operation PBSU Success. They thought it was over. They were wrong. It was just the prologue to a horror story. The destruction of the democratic government created a power vacuum that could only be filled with violence. Castillo Armas was assassinated 3 years later. by his own guard. A succession of military dictators followed, each more brutal than the last. In 1960, the Guatemalan Civil War began. It would last for 36 years. It was a war between the US-backed military government and leftist guerrilla groups, born from the ashes of the Arbenz supporters. But the real victims were the Mayan indigenous people. The military, trained and funded by the US, viewed the Mayan population as the internal enemy. They believed that because the Mayans were poor, they were communists. This led to the silent Holocaust of the 1980s. Under dictator Efrain Ríos Montt, another US ally, the army launched a scorched earth campaign. They wiped out over 600 indigenous villages. They massacred men, women, and children. Over 200,000 people died. Most of them were unarmed civilians. This genocide can be traced directly back to 1954. By removing the moderate, democratic option, Arbenz, the US ensured that the only opposition would be radical. By protecting the United Fruit Company, they sacrificed the human rights of an entire nation. And the blowback wasn't just in Guatemala. The success of 1954 made the CIA arrogant. They looked at the script, exiles plus radio propaganda plus air support equals victory. They thought it was a magic formula. So, in 1961, they tried to use the exact same script against Fidel Castro in Cuba. They recruited exiles. They set up a radio station. They painted planes. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. But Castro had learned from Guatemala. He knew the script. He didn't let his army panic. He didn't resign. He fought back. The Bay of Pigs was a total disaster for the US. The banana coup had taught the revolutionaries of Latin America that they could not trust the US and that they had to be armed to the teeth. It pushed Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The cheap victory of 1954 ended up costing the world almost a nuclear war. The war raged on, but what happened to the company that started it all? Next, we trace the fate of the Octopus, the rebranding, the lawsuits, and the ghostly legacy of United Fruit in the modern supermarket aisle. The United Fruit Company won the War of 1954. They got their land back. They kept their profits. But they lost something they could never buy back: their reputation. The term El Pulpo became known globally. The company became the symbol of Yankee imperialism. Protests targeted their offices across Latin America, and in the US, the government that had saved them eventually turned on them. An antitrust lawsuit in the late 50s forced them to break up some of their monopoly. The business model of the Banana Republic was becoming unsustainable. The world was changing. Dictators were falling. Workers were demanding rights. So, the Octopus did what any smart criminal does. It changed its name. In 1984, after a series of mergers and scandals, including the suicide of their CEO, Eli Black, who jumped out of the Pan Am building in New York, United Fruit rebranded itself. They chose the name of their mascot. They became Chiquita Brands International. Look for the blue sticker on your bananas today. That is the direct descendant of the company that bombed Guatemala. The name is cute. The logo is a smiling woman with a fruit hat. But the DNA is the same. Did they stop their secret wars? Not entirely. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Chiquita admitted in U.S. federal court to paying millions of dollars to paramilitary death squads in Colombia, the AUC, to protect their plantations. They were funding designated terrorist organizations to keep the bananas moving. They paid a $25 million fine. A slap on the wrist. The profits continued. The story of United Fruit is the ultimate case study of corporate immortality. Regimes fall. Presidents die. Ideologies fade. But the corporation survives. It adapts. It rebrands. It keeps selling the fruit. But the legacy of 1954 isn't just a corporate history. It is a wound in the psyche of the Americas. The sticker changed, but the scar remained. Next, we look at the apology that never came, the long road to uncovering the truth, the declassification of the CIA files, and the apology that arrived 50 years too late. For decades, the U.S. government denied any involvement in the coup. They claimed it was a native uprising. They called the accusations of CIA involvement communist propaganda. But secrets have an expiration date. In the late 1990s, the CIA finally declassified the files on Operation PBSU Success. The truth came spilling out in thousands of redacted pages. The files confirmed everything. The bribery, the bombing, the radio lies, the death lists. It was all there, typed in black and white by bureaucrats who thought they were saving the world. We learned the code names, we learned the budget, we learned that the U.S. had specifically targeted a democratic government to protect a corporate monopoly. In 1999, President Bill Clinton visited Guatemala. In a historic moment, he issued an apology. He said, "For the United States, it is important that I state clearly that support for military forces or intelligence units which engaged in violent and widespread repression of the kind described in the report was wrong. It was an admission of guilt. But it couldn't bring back the dead. It couldn't rebuild the democracy that was strangled in the cradle. The apology was a victory for history, but a defeat for justice." No one went to jail. The Dulles brothers have airports and buildings named after them. United Fruit executives kept their bonuses. The files taught us a valuable lesson. Conspiracy theories are often just history that hasn't been declassified yet. The files are open, but the game continues. In our final chapter, we asked the question, are we living in a new banana republic? The players have changed, but the tactics of corporate warfare are more sophisticated than ever. Host. The banana coup of 1954 was a turning point in history. It erased the line between government and corporation. It showed that a private company could effectively rent the foreign policy of a superpower. Today, we don't call them banana republics. We have new words. We talk about lobbying. We talk about regime change. We talk about economic sanctions. But look closely. When tech giants write the laws that regulate them, when oil companies dictate climate policy, when defense contractors push for wars to sell weapons, are these not the echoes of United Fruit? The P-47 Thunderbolts have been replaced by economic hitmen and cyber warfare. The radio station La Voz de la Liberación has been replaced by bot farms and algorithm manipulation. The goal remains the same: to control resources, to crush dissent, and to protect the profit margin at any cost. Jacobo Arbenz tried to build a nation where the land belonged to the people who worked it. He was destroyed because he dared to say no to the octopus. His story is a warning. Sovereignty is fragile. Democracy is not a guarantee. It is a threat to those who profit from inequality. Next time you peel a banana, remember the price that was paid for it. Remember the planes over Guatemala City. Remember the burning books. Remember the secret war. Thank you for watching History Secret Wars. If you want to see the strings that pull the world, make sure you subscribe. Ring the bell, because the octopus never really dies. It just grows new tentacles. This is History Secret Wars. Trust the archives, not the headlines.